November 15, 1909, a 52-year-old man and his 38-year-old wife are sitting at the desk in the front parlor of a small stone house on East Chocolate Avenue in the village of Dairy Church, Pennsylvania. They are signing their names to a legal document called a deed of trust. The woman has been crying off and on since the morning. The man has not. By the time this afternoon is finished, the document will give away their entire chocolate fortune. The factory being built, the company town being built around them, the model streets, the park across the road, the small wooden houses being thrown up for the workers, the milk glass factory, the new township that has not yet been named for them, the train station that has not yet been renamed. All of it by midnight tonight will belong to a school for orphan boys that does not yet exist. Their first class of orphans will not move in until 1910, the year after the deed was signed. The factory is half built. The fortune is 6 years old. The man signing the document has no children and will never have children of his own. His wife's eyes, by every friend's recollection of the room, have been wet the entire time. He is not a man inclined to tears. He is a man who has, in the 12 years of his marriage, never once talked at length about what happens to the chocolate if he and his wife cannot have a son. He is now making his answer with his own hand. The man is Milton Hershey. The deed is the Hershey Trust. The story of what was written in it, and what was taken out of it over the next 100 years, is, in the end, the story of one of America's strangest fortunes. A dynasty with no family, a family name that became a brand name, and the orphan school in rural Pennsylvania that today holds, in trust, the largest single voting stake in any major American candy company. The question every American has asked, looking at this man and his deed, was the same. What was he trying to love? And why did this small, fragile answer keep being eaten alive by the machine it was meant to feed? The boy who would write his name on that deed was born on September 13, 1857, in a small Mennonite homestead in Dauphin County, Pennsylvania. The county is named for France. The homestead was named for nothing in particular. It was a 1.5-story stone house with a wooden addition on the back, and the family that lived in it was the family of Henry Hershey. Henry Hershey, the father, is the part of the story to which every careful biographer of Milton's life returns, because most of the elements that would later make or break the family fortune are already in this man's blood. Henry was, by every first-hand account that survives of him, a restless man. He was a dreamer whose dreams had not, by the time of Milton's childhood, ever quite settled into a single trade. He pressed apple cider. He sold cigars. He tried a shop in the town of Lidditz. He attempted to launch a small newspaper in Harrisburg. He floated briefly, by some accounts, in the insurance business. He went into the trade of plant cuttings. He tried, over the course of his long life, every small American commercial activity available to a farmer's son without completing many of them. He married a young woman from a neighboring Mennonite household named Veronica Fanny Snavely. She was, by every surviving description of her, almost exactly the opposite of Henry. She was disciplined. She was austere. She was stubborn. She was a woman who believed, after the death of her first child, that she had been left in this life with one job, to make sure that the boy who survived her grief became a man who never had to depend on anybody's favor for his living. That boy was Milton. Milton was the only one of 2 children who lived past infancy. His older sister Sarah had died of whooping cough before he could remember her, and the family treated the second child like a thing the Lord had let Fanny borrow for a while. He was not spoiled. He was not mistreated. He was made, by both parents in their different ways, into something either of them might have hoped for. Fanny drilled the lessons. Henry read books to him about the world outside the kitchen. He went to school for 4 years. The 4th grade was as far as he got. By the time he was 9 or 10, he had begun to work with his father on the family's small commercial ventures, and by the time he was 13, the question was no longer whether he would work, but what kind of work. The answer came from an older cousin of his father's, a man in Lancaster County who had gone into candy manufacturing. This cousin was Joseph H. Royer. Royer ran a small candy shop in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and in the spring of 1871 he took on the boy as an apprentice. Milton was not yet 14. By his own later telling, he made 3 cents a week that first year. By the second year, he was making $2. The numbers are small, but the future is already in them. Royer taught him everything there was to teach about the candy business in that part of the country in the 1870s. He taught him which combination of sugar, water, glucose, and cream would set in the right amount of time. He taught him how to read the buccal thermometer. He taught him, above all, what it sounds like when sugar starts to burn. Milton would listen for that sound in his own factories for the next 50 years. He did not finish his apprenticeship. He had, by the time he was 18, begun to want something of his own. In 1876, with what he remembered as roughly $150 in borrowed money, he started his own candy shop in Philadelphia with a friend. The shop lasted roughly 18 months, and then it failed. He went home to Lancaster. He tried again in Philadelphia in 1879 with the help of his aunt Catherine Cassie Hershey, the matriarch of the branch of the family that had done well in trade around Lancaster. He failed again. He tried a third time in New York around 1883, and the city ate what he had. He tried a fourth time in Chicago around 1885, and that failure was, by his own later accounts, so bad that he had to borrow the freight fare home from the baggage master at the train depot. 4 times he had tried. Each time he had been the one who signed the lease, who negotiated with the landlord, who made the candy. Each time he had been the one who went home. The question that most of those who study his rise ask, and that he himself returned to in interviews in his later life, was the obvious one. Why didn't he give up? There were, by his own accounts, roughly 4 years in those years when he could have given up and gone into his father's small ventures. But every attempt at his father's businesses had given him a deep and immediate suspicion of doing the same thing twice. He was, in that quietly American way, a person whose nervous system did not tolerate the kind of family security he had been told was supposed to be the goal of life. The failure rate he had built into himself was, by the time he was 26, the only kind of capital he really had. He came back to Lancaster. He borrowed money from his mother, from his aunt, from his uncle. He started a caramel business on East King Street in Lancaster in 1886, with 1 copper kettle, 1 assistant, and the small technical understanding he had picked up in Royer's shop that the caramel business was, in those years, on the verge of a quiet revolution. The Lancaster Caramel Company was, within a year, the fastest-growing wholesale caramel manufacturer in the region. Within 4 years, it was selling caramels across most of the eastern United States off grocery shelves and candy counters and at county fairs. What had happened, and what most casual histories miss, was that Milton had figured out how to make a caramel that did not stick to the wrapper. The candies that were being made by other Pennsylvania caramel companies stuck to their wax paper wrapper so badly that by the time the consumer peeled one open, half of it was on the paper and half in his hand. Milton figured out, with the help of a Swiss migrant worker, that the problem was the wax itself. He or his Swiss man replaced the paraffin with cacao butter. The candy slid out clean. The Lancaster Caramel Company grew by sales records that have survived in the Hershey archives from local to national in 3 years. By the early 1890s then, he was already a successful middle-aged man. He was making, by his own interviews, in the neighborhood of $1 million a year. He had, by this point, also met Catherine Sweeney, a Quaker woman about 8 years younger than he was, from a family that had been friends with the Hersheys since before either of them was born. He married her in 1898, 1 year before he sold the Caramel Company for approximately $1 million to the American Caramel Company. The sale of the Lancaster Caramel Company was, in some ways, the moment the fortune became possible. He walked away with $1 million in cash. He was, by his own later account, only half sure what to do with it. Then, in 1893, he had gone to the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, where he had walked into a corner of a German exhibit hall and watched a Swiss man named Sprungli run chocolate through machinery that produced, on the spot, a confection that did not exist at any scale in the United States. The object was what would become the milk chocolate bar. The machinery is what the Hershey Chocolate Company was by 1894, building versions of in the back of the Lancaster Caramel Company's quarters. He founded the Hershey Chocolate Company in 1894. He opened the first real chocolate factory on Derry Township, then still called Derry Church, in the fall of that year, in a small building across the street from the family home of one of his foremen. He catered, in those years, mostly to other candy makers, where chocolate was used as a coating for caramels and other confections. The Hershey Chocolate Company was, in those years, a business that supplied chocolate to businesses. The Hershey bar that most Americans would later know did not yet exist. Then, in the winter of 1900, in the same year he had sold the Lancaster Caramel Company, he made a decision that, by every measure, was the founding act of the Hershey Empire. He decided to take the $1 million, cross the state line, build a new chocolate factory on a 100-acre patch of land at the intersection of 2 dirt roads in Derry Church, and arrange the lives of the people who worked there in a way that had not, in living memory, been done in this country. He would, in his own words to the press, make chocolate so cheap that everyone in America could afford a bar of it. It was the most Quaker dream, by way of being the most American entrepreneurial dream in the history of American candy. He broke ground on the new factory on March 2, 1903. He started construction of the model town around the factory that same spring. He signed the deed for the school 6 years later. He was 52 years old when he signed. His wife was 38. They had no children. They would never have children. He signed the deed anyway. By the spring of 1904, the new factory was up. It sat at the bottom of a low rise in south-central Pennsylvania, a long, low brick building with cupolas at each end and a copper-green roof that, when it caught the early light, looked like a horn of green light. Theodoric William Rutter of York, Pennsylvania had designed it. It was bigger than any chocolate factory in the United States. By 1910, it had become one of the larger food manufacturing buildings in the country. The interior was fitted with a labyrinth of steel mesh conveyor belts through which the milk chocolate flowed in a kind of procession, looking, in the descriptions of the day, like a very pale river made of cocoa and sugar and milk. The smell, the descriptions from the period are all more or less the same, was a smell you would never quite forget, even after you had not stood in it for 30 years. By 1905, when the first full year of production was reported to the press, the company was shipping chocolates through Pennsylvania at the rate of roughly 500,000 boxes per month. By 1907, the Hershey Kiss had been introduced at the rear of a small production annex in the factory. By 1909, a single Hershey Kiss machine was producing, by most descriptions, approximately 30,000 of the pointed drop chocolates per day. By 1914, the Hershey bar, as it would be known for the rest of the century, had been calibrated, priced, and distributed at a working scale. By 1920, roughly 50 million Hershey bars a year were being shipped out of the Hershey factory on the Pennsylvania Railroad. Behind the factory, the town was being constructed. Milton had said in a series of conversations with his foreman that began in 1904 that he wanted to build a model town around the factory. He wanted to build houses for the workers. He wanted to build a public park. He wanted to build a school for the workers' children. He wanted to build a park with a swimming pool and a dance pavilion and a baseball ground. By 1907, a small parcel of land across the road from the factory had been leveled and rebuilt as a public park, Hersheypark, and was opened on the 24th of May of 1906, with a ducking pond, a bandstand, picnic tables for the workers, and a small carousel. The company stores, the small brick row houses built to standard dimensions, the paving of the dirt road in front of the factory in the late spring of 1907, the building of a small trolley line that ran from the factory to the neighboring town of Hummelstown, all of these were, by the early years of 1907, also underway. The town was not exactly a company town. Milton insisted, throughout his lifetime, that the houses were owned by the workers and not by the company, but they had been built to a company specification and financed, in the early years, with company-backed mortgages. They had been paid for out of the wages of the men who lived in them. The distinction was thinner than the company liked to admit. In 1909, the same year the school deed was signed, a second, very large park, the Hersheypark that would grow into one of the great American amusement enterprises, was being laid out on a 40-acre parcel east of the factory. By 1912, the park had a small carousel, a shooting gallery, a figure-8 roller coaster that was, by reports of the day, the largest wooden coaster yet built, and a football field sized to play inter-team matches. The park had, in 1910, already been opened to the public for an admission price of 25 cents. By 1920, it had become a regional destination. In the second decade of the new century, the town that was no longer called Dairy Church was being incorporated as Hershey, Pennsylvania. Hershey Station on the Pennsylvania Railroad was renamed. The Hershey Press was founded to print the publicity. The town was, by every surface measurement of the period, a model industrial town of the American kind. The factory employed, at the peak production years of the 19-teens, in the neighborhood of 3,000 people in the building alone. Many more worked in the surrounding town. In 1933, during the worst of the Great Depression, when most American companies were firing workers and shutting down, Milton Hershey decided to build a hotel. The Hotel Hershey opened its doors on May 16, 1933, after roughly 28 months of construction. It was designed in a Mediterranean style, with white limestone walls and a copper-roofed cupola. The architect was Lansdale Walker of Philadelphia. The grounds were laid out by the Olmsted brothers. The whole project had cost, by his biographer's count, somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 million, money he had paid out year after year to keep roughly 400 stonemasons, plumbers, electricians, and carpenters working through the worst of the Depression. Reporters of the day called it the most extravagant thing he had ever done with money. 2 years before the hotel opened, in 1931, he had already started building the mansion on a hilltop 2 miles north of the factory. The mansion was called High Point. It was designed by a Lancaster architect named C. M1 Urban, with input from the Hershey family, and was finished at a cost that he variously reported to the press as being somewhere between $40,000 and $100,000. It contained roughly 25 rooms, including a 15-foot wide drawing room, a library, a solarium, a music room equipped with 2 Steinway pianos, an indoor-outdoor swimming pool, a conservatory, and a small private office with a desk at which he wrote letters. The High Point mansion sat on top of a hill from which, on a clear day, you could see the entire factory district. Hershey was visible from every window of the second floor.